Hello and welcome. How much on edge are Middle Eastern leaders in light of the recent uprisings, and are they actively trying to get the upper hand? As the Arab Spring continues to blossom, a counter-revolution is taking hold of the region, with Saudi Arabia at the helm. During Egypt's uprising, the Saudis pushed for Hosni Mubarak to remain in power and are now threatening to withdraw investments in the country if the deposed president is put on trial. Riyadh is also trying to broker a deal for the Yemeni president, Ali Abdullah Saleh, to step down in exchange for immunity in an attempt to end protests in that country. Within the monarchy itself, the Saudi royal family has long quelled all demonstrations calling for reform. Well, last month the kingdom deployed troops to Bahrain as a gesture of support for the Sunni-led monarchy who rule over the Shia majority population. Some consider Bahrain the focal point of a struggle between Sunni-led Saudi Arabia and Shia-led Iran, as each country continues to vie for dominance in the Gulf region. So today we ask, will newfound freedoms across the Middle East affect Saudi Arabia's hold on the region? Remember, you can join our conversation with your questions and comments. You can send an SMS or an email, and we welcome your phone calls on the show as well. Joining me here in DC is Salman Sheikh, Director of the Brookings Doha Center and Fellow at the Saban Center for Middle East Policy, where he focuses on mediation and conflict resolution issues facing the Middle East and South Asia. Also with us in Washington is Dr. Thomas Mater, the Executive Director of the Middle East Policy Council. He has served as a consultant to governments and businesses on security and economic issues in the Gulf. Gentlemen, I welcome you both to the show.
Thank you.
Salman Sheikh, I'm going to start with you first, if I may, and just ask you, when people talk about this being an Arab revolution, a pan-Arab event, is it really, as such, taking hold that fast yet?
Yes, it is. I think from Morocco to Yemen, we are seeing loud voices for change, for a democratization, for political reform, based on people seeking dignity and justice and opportunity, all the things that they've been missing in their lives for the last 30, 40, 50 years.
But there was talk of leaderships falling like dominoes, and that hasn't really happened.
No, this of course reflects the very unique character of each country. So we could have got carried away when we saw Tunisia go in just under 20 days, or Egypt in a similar amount of time. Now we've seen with Libya how difficult it is in certain cases, or in Yemen, for these regimes just to fall.
Well, Dr. Thomas Mater, good to have you with us, sir. And of course, Saudi Arabia has always been seen as a major power in there, and a power broker. What do you think Saudi Arabia is thinking right now?
About the entire region, or specifically about Bahrain?
Well, I guess its position in what's going on in the first case.
Well, Saudi Arabia did not want to see Mubarak fall. And Saudi Arabia obviously has to be concerned about what happens in Yemen, because Al-Qaeda, if it became stronger there, could pose a challenge to the kingdom. And it's concerned about Bahrain, because Iran has made claims to that island in the past. Iran could exploit the disturbances there, and if it were to succeed in gaining a greater foothold there, such as it has succeeded in Iraq, that would pose a security challenge to the Saudi government.
How likely is it, Dr. Mater, for something to happen in Saudi Arabia in the same way it's happened in Tunisia or Egypt?
I wouldn't say it's very likely, because it's a much richer country. It has poured money into the development of its economy. It has diversified its economy. It has educated its citizenry. That doesn't mean it doesn't have any problems. Obviously, it's producing so many students and college graduates that it has trouble finding employment for all of them. But you don't have the same economic dissatisfaction in Saudi Arabia to the same extent that you will find it in some of the other countries. And in a sense, the royal family is a unifying force there, so it is respected. And the king is seen as a reformer, so he is admired. There is a desire for more change by some people, faster change by some people. But I don't think you're going to see that regime challenged the way it has been in other countries.
Well, Salman Sheikh, I want to put to you an email we received from Kenya, if I could. I'll read this out to you. It says, and it's from Kiragu Titus in Nairobi in Kenya. It says, Saudi Arabia would like to see the status quo maintained and present a facade that everything is fine in the Middle East. They have only succeeded in delaying the revolution, but not killing it. Now I'm wondering, I'm not sure if they mean that the revolution just in Saudi Arabia or in a more broad regional sense, but I wonder to what degree can they really ignore what's happening in a broader sense?
Well, I think Saudi Arabia is actually looking for stability, both internally and externally, at a time of great change. And this is not something I think they're going to be able to hold back, that change. So in terms of Saudi Arabia and its development, I think we're looking at change coming to Saudi Arabia over a period of time.
Well, the royals, Dr. Mateo, the royals did try to offset any potential sort of public discontent or malcontent through increasing benefits, for example, for soldiers, and showing that programs were being developed for the people. How effective do you think those will be?
Well, again, economic disparities and economic dissatisfaction has been one major theme, in addition to the call for greater political representation. So I think that dispersing these sums of money to make housing more affordable and provide loans to the unemployed and other welfare will go some way to easing discontent and giving the regime time to deal with the inevitable demands for reform, and for them to figure out how much reform they can introduce and how quickly. Because remember that in Saudi Arabia, you don't only have liberals seeking more political participation, but you have conservatives thinking that the king has already introduced too much political reform.
Well, Salman Sheikh, what political price do you think Saudi Arabia might pay for sending its troops into Bahrain?
I think we're already seeing the Saudi intervention raising the specter of greater sectarian tensions in the region, as well as the possibility of regional spillover. What is going on in Bahrain now, I think, is opening up a Pandora's box of existing tensions, particularly with Iran. We're going from a situation of what was effectively a Cold War to a series of hot rhetoric. And this, I fear, will lead us into a more escalatory set of conflicts in the region.
Well, apparently now, just now, the U.S. government has expressed its concern that Bahrain is seeking to dissolve the country's main Shiite Muslim opposition group, Wafaq, which won 18 of the 40 seats in parliament in the last election. And what's the likely impact of that move?
Absolutely. In fact, Wafaq may well have won even more seats. I think many people would say that the gerrymandering of electoral districts and the votes actually reduced its vote. Look, we have to try and maintain a space for dialogue in the kingdom. Right now, the actions of the Bahraini royal family are closing that space. We are having increasing arrests and detentions, as well as this extraordinary move regarding the Wafaq party. In fact, the Wafaq party has been seen as part of the more mainstream moderate opposition of parties, a group of 7. And the longer that these kinds of actions go on, we're not going to have that space for the dialogue. I think that is inevitable.
Dr. Mateo, the US seems to have kept a fairly backseat posture in all of this, but I wonder what's going on behind the scenes and how the US might be a little more actively involved in trying to shape things there.
Well, obviously the United States would like to see political reform in Bahrain and thinks that the ruling family in Bahrain has missed an opportunity to offer reform that would dampen down dissent. But the United States, I think, sees that it has to balance its ideological national interests and its strategic national interests. And it can see that vocal support for reform in Bahrain made the Saudis nervous because of the security challenge that could emerge from Bahrain. So understanding what an important ally the Saudis are has led the United States to not oppose vigorously the Saudi intervention, but to hope that the Saudi intervention would give the Bahraini family time to make amends and make reforms. And I am sure that the Obama administration is talking to the Bahraini royal family about that.
I wonder also, Salman, how much the US's credibility has been dented by virtue of the fact it was closely allied to Hosni Mubarak and even gave breathing space to Muammar Gaddafi and others in the region, and now seems to have essentially turned against them. Yes.
The US policy regarding this crisis has been initially reactive rather than proactive. It's what I call hesitant diplomacy. But I have to say that in the last few weeks, we're seeing that President Obama and Secretary Clinton, who's just been speaking in Washington, I think they have found their voices. In fact, the equation of values and interests being somewhat different, I think, is being realigned. And we actually heard Secretary Clinton talking about the convergence of values and interests. This is, of course, what is worrying the Saudis and those others who are wanting to and seeking stability in the region right now.
Now, I wonder, we had Dr. Mateo, how much of the tensions are really being created around this Shia-Sunni axis, which is often, given a lot of credence for what is happening in the region. How much is it more just a distraction from underlying economic and social tensions? How much is the Shia-Sunni tension a real factor in shaping what's going on?
Well, in Bahrain, the Shias have been disadvantaged, and that's an issue that the ruling family should address. In Saudi Arabia, one could make the same argument, although the ruling family there, the royal family there, has tried to make their situation better over the last decade. There are philosophical differences about the way they practice their religion. There are suspicions. Shias suspect the Sunnis, and Sunnis suspect the Shias. And certainly for the Sunnis, there is a concern that the Shias represent a potential fifth column or a potential avenue for Iran to intervene in their domestic affairs. And clearly Iran has tried to do that in the past. So any Iranian member of the Revolutionary Guard looking at the situation today would have to see an opportunity for themselves.
I'll touch more on that in a second, but we have a caller on the line from Virginia. We have Oliver with us. Oliver, thanks for joining the show. What would you like to ask?
Thank you very much, Riz. Actually, I'm a very big supporter of the King of Saudi Arabia. He's a good reformer. But through my experience with the Saudi students here in the U.S., I noticed that many of the Saudi students, male and females, when they come to the United States and to the West, they like to adopt the Western democracy of principle and principles. So when they go back, they like to challenge the traditional religion.
Oh, I think we lost Oliver there, but I think the idea was, perhaps Dr. Mateo, I could put this to you, that the idea that students come here from Saudi Arabia, they get a sense of what Western-style democracy is, and then go back, and then they don't. He was trying to say they don't have a chance to challenge the authority there and change things back home.
Their opportunities are limited. It's not a democracy. They don't pretend to be a democracy. They have a different way of governing. They have a different way of communicating with their population and listening to their population's grievances. And for some people in Saudi Arabia, there's actually a concern that if you introduced one man, one vote, you would find that the result would be a much more conservative society than the one that is emerging today.
Now, one thing, Salman Sheikh, the Saudi government seems to be concerned that Egypt is willing to engage more with Iran nowadays. I mean, after 3 decades of, a distance. And I wonder how much that really is worrying the Saudis and also the other Arab nations nearby.
Well, certainly for Saudi Arabia, this is yet again another indication of shifting balances and dynamics in the region. I think what is particularly interesting and worrisome for the Saudis is the timing of this move by the Egyptians. The Egyptians, I think, are trying and apply a more even-handed approach, going for some sort of normalization with the Iranians. But this comes at the back of rising tensions between Saudi Arabia and the GCC states and Iran. So this is definitely something of concern to them.
And it would change the dynamic with Israel too, presumably.
It would. This is still something which we're going to see play out. I think a lot will depend on the next president of Egypt, as well as, of course, the role of the military in Egypt. I think the role of militaries, whether in Turkey or Indonesia, other places also, has a very important impact on guiding these transitions.
Now, Dr. Mateo, I know you've studied Iran extensively and what it's capable of and where it is going as such, but a lot of people are saying that Iran right now is sitting back and just watching the chaos unfold. How much do you believe that it is taking a back seat as opposed to being a little more proactive in trying to fix things?
I don't think it has to do much now. I think it can sit back, but as I said, opportunities are emerging, and it doesn't take much to have 1 or 2 or 3 agents enter an environment and mobilize events.
We have an email from France, and Salman, if I could put this to you, came from Karim in Paris, who wrote in saying, Iran and Saudi Arabia choose to enhance or resist revolutions depending on their relationships with the countries involved. Revolution in the Middle East may become a new geopolitical industry rather than human reactions. It's a Cold War under an Arab skin. How do you regard that view?
It is a Cold War. I think it's a view which is definitely relevant, and I think it recognizes that there are 2 sets of narratives which are in train right now. there is the older narrative of these tensions between Saudi Arabia and its allies and Iran, based also on sectarian issues. And then there is the new narrative of these Arab awakenings. And the question is will the Arab awakening be swamped, be overwhelmed by some of the older conflicts, then subsuming what's going on right now?
It's actually interesting, Dr. Mattea, you know, this issue of the Arab awakenings that Salman Sheikh is talking about, because the Gulf and North Africa has certainly seen strained or helped to strain dynamics between certain countries. Saudi Arabia is not really willing to help Yemen's government too much because of the border issue, you know, being relatively porous. And of course, Qatar has even faced criticism for sticking its neck out with Libya and supporting those, you know, against the government in Libya. How much is this affecting Arab unity in the region?
Well, obviously there's Arab unity and Arab disunity simultaneously. There always has been. But I think there are areas of agreement, and Bahrain is one of those areas of agreement. When it comes to Libya, you have the UAE and Qatar both introducing fighter jets into the equation, and while Saudi Arabia is not doing that, Saudi Arabia also wants to see the fall of Gaddafi. So those countries, I would say the GCC countries, are thinking in the same terms about what's going on in the region.
Well, of course, Salman, Yemen only seems to be getting worse, and the more pressure that's put on President Ali Abdullah Saleh, he seems to be more entrenched and less willing to go. And I wonder what the implications are for Saudi Arabia and of course, the other neighboring countries if Yemen does collapse into a conflict.
Of course, that is the concern for Saudi Arabia and the other GCC states. What they are looking for is stability coming from Yemen. And this is why I think that reluctantly they've come around and are now pressing for Saleh to go, because he's now a factor for instability.
Well, actually, Dr. Mattea, an email question for you, sir, if I may. This is coming from Saudi Arabia, from Jeddah, where Fawz Alvi wrote in saying, what the Middle East needs is evolution of mindsets and ideas, not revolution against the present regimes, only to get other pro-Western governments elected, like in Iraq and Egypt. So I wonder, that's something that I've heard in the discussion. What's next in the Arab world? Is it simply just handing over power and not building civic institutions and giving someone else a chance to become, you know, an autocrat or dictator? Or is there actually some concern now about trying to build civic society up a little bit more to be more responsible for its future?
Well, you have to have a civic society to have a democracy. You can't just have a transition of power. And I don't think that we can be clear on what these transitions are yet or how they're going to end yet. Take Egypt as an example. It hasn't been a revolution. It's been, the leadership has been driven from office, but the military is still playing a very important role. And it will have something to say about the transition and how much reform is permissible, because they are going to safeguard their own positions. So there, I think, even if a new government comes into being with the blessing of the military, it's going to have a terrible time governing, because the problems there are grave for any government. And that's, I think, something that will be true in many of these countries. It's not just turning over power. It's who is going to get the power and what circumstances are they facing.
There seems to be, Dr. Mattea, there seems to be less concern now about there being an overwhelming Islamic kind of movement, and the idea that extremism will take hold in somewhere like Egypt now. Is that the case, that the US isn't so worried about that anymore?
Well, it's not an outcome the US desires, but I think that the initial concern about Egypt has diminished somewhat, because the Muslim Brotherhood is a moderate institution. There are extremist elements in Egypt. It's the Islamic groups which assassinated Sadat and which gave birth to Zawahiri, who joined Osama bin Laden. But they are small, and they are not as relevant as the Muslim Brotherhood. And the Muslim Brotherhood's only contesting about 1/3 of the seats in the next parliamentary election, so they clearly can't dominate a government. Some Islamist influence in the government is fine, especially when it's moderate. There's no need to worry about that. It's only fanatical extremist Islamist influence that has to concern us.
We have a call on the line from Ireland. Sally's with us. Sally, thanks for joining us. What would you like to ask?
Thank you. Yes, your panel mentioned before that the king in Saudi Arabia is seen as progressive by some quarters, but I just wondered if they would like to comment on what this does and could in the future mean for women.
Okay, that's an interesting question. I mean, Salman Sheikh, I know, well, the king is said to be something of a reformer and really trying to change the situation. Of course, he has to tread quite carefully because the country is quite mixed in its constitution with a lot of conservatives. So what do you know, Sally's asking, what are the implications for women in somewhere like Saudi Arabia?
Yeah, first of all, King Abdullah is widely respected in the kingdom. He's probably the one man who can push forward the much needed reforms that the kingdom needs, whether it's social, educational, political, and others. Regarding the role of women, though, we've seen that this has been this kind of liberalization has been too far for him as well so far. And what comes next may well determine that particular fate as well. My concern is that we may well see a more conservative trend, especially as Saudi Arabia, concerned with the situation in the region, seeks to gain security by establishing and maintaining its links with the religious establishment.
Based on that thought, do you think that would encourage those with a more conservative attitude to be more proactive in places such as Egypt, maybe Tunisia?
There is a possibility, but I think here the momentum is coming from those people themselves. Egyptians are by and large in charge of their own fate, as well as in Tunisia. And though we've seen 2 steps back, 1 step forward in both of these transitions, I'm quite hopeful that through dialogue and through a process of learning and constitution and lawmaking, they will actually make progress, which is perhaps different. Perhaps from what we'd see in Saudi Arabia.
Well, Dr. Mansour, there's been more visible European involvement than US involvement, certainly in what's going on in the MENA region right now. And I wonder to what degree it's been important for the US and its allies, including Europe, to stay as much as possible out of the picture so that it's seen very much as an Arab street revolution, if you like. It's not been engineered by the West.
Mm-hmm. Well, the West is very involved in Libya. It's to our advantage not to be seen as being at the forefront of that because we're already in 2 wars. Mm-hmm. And what happens in North Africa is of considerable concern to Europe. But yes, I think in the wider region, we don't want this to be ours. We don't want to own this. This is an indigenous development, the native people seeking change. And for us to be too involved anywhere would sully, the meaning of this movement.
Of course, Salman Sheikh, this is an interesting thought because what a lot of people have been wondering is when there have been leaders entrenched in power for decades, there's been a lot of oppression of independent thought or perhaps opposition parties. Are there the right kind of people ready to take over? As Dr. Mateo had mentioned, there's still uncertainty about what's going to happen in the future, and I think everyone agrees on that. But do you feel that the societies in countries such as Tunisia and Egypt, perhaps we see what may change in Libya and Yemen as well, do you think they're ready to take the mantle and create a cohesive institution-building society?
I think they are. Over the last few weeks, I've met some very impressive Tunisians and Egyptians and other Arabs who are now full of hope. They understand that the job ahead is going to take a very long amount of time, and they also are seeking to learn from other transitions, whether in Eastern Europe or in Southeast Asia. Indonesia is a country I've mentioned before. But by and large, leaders emerge when you establish the basis of systems which are sustainable, which are able to reflect the wishes and aspirations of their people. And I'm fairly confident that over a period of time, these leaders will emerge as they go through the process of transition.
Right.
I'd just like to add to that I think there is an educated middle class in Tunisia that is experienced enough to run, right. And also there are people in Egypt. Libya is another question.
Right. Well, gentlemen, I have to end it there. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but thank you both for your comments. Very helpful. Thank you. And thank you for joining us with your questions. Remember, you can follow our program on Twitter. We'll keep you notified on upcoming shows, and you can send us questions and comments to pose to our guests. On the next show, the impact of the financial crisis on unemployment around the world. We explore the culture of work with renowned philosopher Alain de Botton. Be sure to tune in for that. From me and the team, we'll see you next time.